I'm Ashley Trueluck, Chairman of the Foundation, and coincidentally acting as High Sheriff of Wiltshire this year. The role of the Foundation, simply put, is to act as a focal point for the collection and distribution of money and information for the benefit of communities across Wiltshire, both the rural county and urban Swindon. And the role of the High Sheriff is very similar in this particular respect. It's to act as a conduit between government agencies on the one hand and local communities on the other. So being double-hatted this year has proved to be, despite my initial concerns, a convergence rather than a conflict of interest and time during a crisis when it's been really important that we get everybody working together for the greater good. Now, just to unfold the story, the coronavirus pandemic arrived just as the Foundation were completing a root and branch strategic analysis of our role. We concluded that the Foundation needed to get out of its comfort zone a little and to take a more proactive role in support of Wiltshire's voluntary and community sector. We coined a mnemonic, the mnemonic BRICS, B-R-I-C-K-S, to remind ourselves of the core values we wanted to form the foundation of our mission going forward. And these have proved particularly appropriate in the present crisis because BRICS stands for, first, brave, resourceful, informed and innovative, collaborative, kind, and strategic. And they form the basis of everything we've been doing, and particularly during this crisis. So, for example, before the pandemic reached crisis proportions, we took the brave decision to release Rosemary MacDonald, who'd been our chief executive very effectively for the last 12 years, to go and work in London with the United Kingdom Community Foundation and with the National Emergency Trust, and so release millions of pounds for coronavirus support nationwide. And Wiltshire's benefited from its pro rata share of this money. Back at the ranch here in Devizes, Fiona Oliver, our Development and Marketing Director, who's with us today, and Vicky Hickey, our Finance Director, were dropped in the deep end, stepping up jointly to take on the CEO role in addition to their day jobs, just as the crisis broke and lockdown and home working began. But despite this, the staff showed great resourcefulness in setting up the Wiltshire and Swindon coronavirus appeal with the help from trustees and volunteers. So I have to say, it's been a magnificent achievement, a real team effort. And Fiona Oliver will tell you more about this in a few moments. Now, crisis is always a breeding ground for innovation, and we've seen some truly inspirational people and innovative ideas come forward to respond to coronavirus. This involved us having to be equally innovative in terms of streamlining our charity procedures to respond to the rapidly emerging situation. And Sue Webber, who's the trustee who oversees our grants process, will say more about how we did this and the results that were achieved. And finally, the Foundation has an excellent network within the county voluntary sector and allocates significant resources to analysing the causes and effects of deprivation across the county and building a clear picture of the long-term impact of coronavirus and how the various support agencies across Wiltshire can collaborate going forward is going to be absolutely key to how we target the money we have available in future. And these are the complex issues which our final two speakers, Margaret Firth, who is the Foundation Strategic Analyst, and Suzanne Wigmore from Citizens Advice Bureau will say more about. So, having introduced the speakers, let me hand over to Fiona Oliver to start the ball rolling. Fiona.
Thank you, Ashley. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. It does feel like a bit of a lifetime ago, since the 13th of March, which was when we had our board meeting and we discussed the coronavirus response and potential partnership with the National Emergencies Trust. We actually launched our appeal on 20th of March and wrote out to 700 of our supporters. Within 7 days, we actually set an initial target of £50,000 for the campaign. We weren't sure about how it was going to go at all. We'd just come off the back of running our Surviving Winter campaign, which we run over 6 months over the winter months, and that normally brings in between 75 and 90,000. And we'd just come off the back of, well, hadn't quite closed it. And so to then go out to our supporters to go again was quite a big deal for us. We couldn't believe it. Within the first 7 days, we'd received £100,000 in donations, and it was pretty clear that we were going to need to get a new target. We'd also agreed to sign a partnership with the National Emergencies Trust at our board meeting on the 13th of March, and they went on to launch their national campaign to raise money for coronavirus response, launched by the Duke of Cambridge. They've now raised almost £90 million through that national campaign, and we had signed to be the distributor of that funding in Wiltshire and Swindon, along with the 45 other community foundations across the UK. We've now received just over 500,000 from that partnership, which has all gone towards providing immediate relief for people in need across the county. And our own local campaign has raised just over £500,000 as well. So at each stage, we were resetting targets. I think we went from 50,000 to 100,000, then to 500,000. And we're absolutely delighted to say that we've smashed the £1 million target and set a new one at 1.5 million. But, you know, we know that we're far from over. The immediate response from the donors has been fantastic. It's obviously captured everybody's imagination. Everybody can relate to what to the problems that people are facing, whether that's loneliness, isolation, poverty. Everybody knows someone or is suffering themselves as a result of the coronavirus. So we're just so heartened by the response. But the key thing for us is to say that we're not done. Then Maggie, could we go to the next slide? That's brilliant, thank you. So we've actually, so far, we've awarded over £650,000 through 168 grants. We've helped an estimated 100,000 local people, and 200,000 of grants are under assessment or awaiting panel decision at the moment. And we know that there's a continuous flow of applications arriving. I think what we've seen is a change in those applications, and Sue will certainly be talking about that after me. And next slide, Maggie. Thank you. So I think the key thing for us is that the campaign is not stopping. We intend to continue. We're currently in talks with UK community foundations who are putting in a tender for the government money, which so there's DCMS money, which is likely to provide a match fund. So UKCF pitching for that, and we're involved in that. And as soon as we know whether or not we have those match funds available, we'll be writing out to donors again. The key things are to continue to provide immediate relief for local people in need, and to continue to support the survival of the voluntary sector, because as you'll hear from Margaret and Suzanne, the challenges that they're facing now are great, and our role in supporting them is needed more now than ever. Our board has committed to doubling our investment into local communities, and Ashley will talk about that more towards the end of the session. So that is the campaign in a very short nutshell. We have got a video which we will be sharing by email after today's webinar, so you'll be able to see some of the people who have received the grants. But to hear more about how our grants are made, I'm going to hand over to Sue Webber, who's the chair of our Programmes Delivery Committee. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Fiona. Hi, everybody. So I'm Sue Webber, and I'm going to tell you about how we're giving out the money. You've heard from Fiona that we've given out 168 grants. For those we fund, the desperate challenge has been to work out how they could support their users and fund any new activity, and to find ways to survive financially into 2021 and beyond. For us at WCF, the challenge has been to make fair and consistent and accountable decisions, bearing in mind the community and donor expectations. So I'm really proud of our staff response. We've had a slimmed down application process because we wanted to be speedy, supportive and flexible. So decisions were often made by trustees overnight. Our first grant was approved on the 30th of March and paid out on the 1st of April. So very, very shortly after the whole appeal was launched. So why are small and local organisations so important? They know their users and their communities really well. They could devise solutions which they knew would work, even if though it was a challenge to do so. And there was a huge surge in need to be met locally. And also, why were voluntary organisations so seriously affected? They immediately lost income, literally overnight. No fees for services, fundraising completely halted, some fundraisers furloughed. Charity shops were closed. There was no income from renting out space, no fees for expert training they could deliver, and trading income was lost. Also, many volunteers are over 70 or are themselves shielding, so organisations became abruptly short-staffed. By their nature, the organisations work with some of the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people of all ages, so there was a big need. And most of their work is face-to-face and often activities in groups. So how could they possibly be able to continue their work? Next slide, please, Maggie. So this is shows you a combination of the types of support we've been helping and the types of people we've been helping. So food was by far and away a big one. Food parcels, fresh food, food stock for food banks, hot cooked meals delivered, and the all-important petrol costs for volunteer deliverers who are going way beyond their normal work. The costs of giving remote support and activities, both one-to-one and in groups via telephone, Zoom and WhatsApp, a steep learning curve for everybody, including us today, I guess, on a Zoom call. Kitting out of temporary accommodation for housed homeless people. Simple PPE, cleaning materials, hand sanitisers and gloves. Resource packs of all sorts, activity packs, well-being packs. Support for young people on the streets. Additional staff costs for debt advice, domestic abuse advice, and new community hubs. Hospice care at home. And these were often in combination because IT and technology has been a key. You'll not be surprised by the types of people involved. Vulnerable, disadvantaged and isolated of all ages. Self-isolating and shielding, older people, asylum seekers and refugees, homeless people, people with mental health issues, people with all kinds of disabilities. People in poverty, including those thrust into poverty overnight. Young people and children, no school, no activities and few resources. Those experiencing domestic abuse, bereaved adults and children. And again, these are not exclusive categories. People can fall in more than one category. To make this a bit more real, out of the 168, I have just 1 or 2 case studies. So Age UK Wiltshire had a grant of 2,750, I'm sorry. And we gave a grant for 2 commercial freezers. They were operating their Meals and Wheels services around Swindon, but they wanted to extend to Salisbury and the south of the county, so they had to extend their capacity. The Harbour project had an initial grant of 4,500 to provide support to refugees and asylum seekers that have been dispersed to Swindon by the Home Office. Apart from accommodation, they're provided with just £39 a week for all food and essential living costs. And during the lockdown, 36 new asylum seekers, including 18 children, have arrived. Normally, Harbour provides on a day-to-day basis activities and food. Poverty is a real issue. So right at the start of the crisis, the Harbour project applied for a grant to enable them to provide basic foods, and I really do mean basic, in fortnightly food parcels. As an example of our next phase recovery grant, we've just provided a further grant of 2,100 towards reopening, for cleaning, for screens and barriers, safe working arrangements and additional rent to allow exclusive use of their space. The next would be Swindon Women's Aid. They received a grant of £10,000 to fund the cost of an independent domestic abuse advisor for 6 months to support women in the refuge in the community. And this is a quite complex idea because at the start of the pandemic, they saw an immediate increase in calls, particularly from young women seeking to flee home, and also from women needing support for the first time to cope at home. You probably saw in the press that nationally domestic abuse calls rose by 120%. Why it's complex is that the money for the majority of their advisors comes from their own fundraising activities and their charity shop, both of which had to stop because of the pandemic. The organisation was at risk of having to significantly reduce the service that they could offer at a time when their support was critically needed. So the funding for the independent domestic abuse advisor was really quite vital. Another one was young Melksham, to whom we gave a grant of 4,320. When centre-based activities for young people had to be suspended, a grant to young Melksham enabled them to provide detached, trained youth workers. They could support disadvantaged and vulnerable young people and those not observing social distancing rules out on the streets and in the skate park. The workers could also help prevent young people getting into trouble while giving general safety information on drugs, internet safety and dispute resolution. So, the WCF response, our advantage is that we know Wiltshire and Swindon well. We've got detailed research, as Maggie will show later. Sorry, as Margaret will show you later. We can map our grants against the data. We've participated in and provided some leadership within county networks, coordinating meetings and wellbeing forums. While our grants were being given on an almost daily basis, we could quickly spot where we needed to develop policies for consistency, e.g. on demands to meet urgent food needs, on funding for PPE, on funding new groups who could do great work but were not formally constituted, on ensuring coordination and avoiding duplication. So the advice and support to groups, something that we call Funder Plus. So equally important has been the substantial advice and support staff and our assessors have been able to offer during the application process. For example, on costing and structuring applications, advice on other sources of funding, other organisations they should be linking with, safeguarding issues. New groups lacked experience in applying and needing extra help. We were able to give that in some detail to enable them to apply and successfully achieve a grant. So the good news in all of this, we've got a 91% success rate for applications because the money has been because the money has been available from the amazing donations locally and from NET. We've been able to fund a very high proportion of applications. If the proposal was sound and well thought through, it could be funded. The feedback from applicants has been positive. They say how supportive our assessment process has been at a time when they were anxious and under extreme pressure. Communities have risen to the challenge. Many previously unconnected, lonely people have been identified and responded to. Because people were more home-based and focusing locally, more questions were being asked about, well, who lives here? Who are our neighbours? How are they coping with lockdown and with the pandemic? How should we be helping? New groups have emerged in neighbourhoods, villages and small towns to meet local needs in new ways. Perhaps they will survive into the future and community and neighbourliness will take on a whole new meaning. We hope so. Organisations have also worked together in unprecedented ways because that was the only way they could make it work. And we have been involved in this too. So going forward, There's still a great deal of work to be done. Our response and recovery fund will be active for a long time. As Fiona has mentioned, the very survival of local groups and organisations is at stake. Some local organisations may not survive, but WCF is working out how we can best support their recovery. As the Harbour example showed, we've already moved on to helping charities meet the costs of reopening safely and recover from financial losses. We're achieving this by listening a lot, sharing our thinking in a very open way, being prepared to think on our feet, but develop clear guidelines as we've gone along. Above all, being flexible and being prepared to change as the scenario developed. So thank you for listening to that, and I'm now going to hand over to Margaret Furr.
Sorry, unmuting myself. It must be the common theme of all these meetings at the moment. Hi everybody, my name's Margaret and I'm Wiltshire Community Foundation's Research and Engagement Manager. I thought I'd give you a little bit of an overview of some of the emerging picture that we're finding. I think it's being increasingly apparent that the impacts locally are really actually the indirect consequences of lockdown and social distancing, rather than actual direct impact or high levels of infection of coronavirus. The infection rates across Wiltshire and Swindon are relatively rather low, but that doesn't mean communities have not been vulnerable to the wider impacts of COVID-19. The map here that I have put up for you shows local priority areas using the COVID-19 Vulnerability Index, which was developed by the British Red Cross, using a combination of data around clinical information, demographic and social vulnerability. And particularly early on in the lockdown, we used this type of analysis along with our other assessments to ensure our funding was reaching those most in need. As time's developed, it's clear that COVID-19 has widened some of the existing inequalities in our communities, but it's also created new ones. And also, really importantly, the impact has not been the same for everybody. The gaps between the economically better off and those less well off in our communities will grow as a result of coronavirus. Sector shutdowns, social distancing and school closures have all disproportionately affected certain parts of the population. Some priorities for the foundation have been reinforced, but within all of those, the situations and those affected will have been changed. I'm going to touch briefly on the themes of poverty, loneliness and young people. Next slide please, Maggie. Thank you. So looking at poverty, Wiltshire generally, I mean, I think most of you obviously as supporters of the foundation will know, although it's perceived as an affluent area, there are inequalities in terms of deprivation and health. And those pre-existed coronavirus. 48 of our neighbourhoods across Wiltshire and Swindon are ranked nationally within the 30 most deprived. And in some of our most deprived wards, 40% of our children live in poverty. Simply put, poverty is when your resources are well below your minimum needs. And certainly at the beginning of lockdown, that affected many people. I've picked this image because I think it's from some research done by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And I think it illustrates where we are now in terms of our changing situation. So this uses Joseph Rowntree's Foundation's minimum standard income. So the green bit, the roof, the green section represents that minimum line. So those above that have adequate income or better. They have a decent standard of living. The yellow section, those who have inadequate income, but not necessarily in poverty. They may be under pressure. And then the orange and red illustrates those who are struggling or maybe destitute. They may be struggling to pay their bills or buy essentials for their family. Recent research by the Institute of Fiscal Studies found that 30% of low-income families and households said they could not manage a month if they lost their main income. So COVID has meant that those circumstances have been exacerbated. Particularly low-income workers will have lost their incomes or had them reduced. In contrast, affluent families will have effectively had savings forced upon them. Their outgoings, such as transport or entertainment costs, will have gone down. Suzanne will explain shortly the local picture regarding employment, but just looking back at the image of this house, many of those who are in the yellow will have fallen into the orange or maybe on into the red, whereas often those in the green will still be very much green, thus widening the inequalities felt across the county. So why does this matter? Poverty is not just about money, it affects all aspects of people's lives. People on lower incomes are much more likely to experience poor physical and mental health. The consequences of poverty mean higher levels of mental health problems, housing problems, lower education and attainment. Poverty in childhood increases the risk of unemployment and low pay in adulthood. Families with children, lone parents, those with disabilities and people from ethnic minorities are more likely to live in poverty. Living in poverty makes a difference, not only to the money you have, but to the levels of debt that you are in, whether you have savings or whether you have long-term health and well-being. This is why the indirect effects of COVID-19 will be significant for a long time. Many people who were just about managing before COVID will be tipping into poverty for the first time. I also wanted to touch on loneliness. We did a big piece of work last year looking at loneliness, some of the consequences of loneliness and how it exhibited in Wiltshire particularly. Coronavirus has changed the daily life for all of us really. Shielding, social distancing means we've all experienced the way we exhibit our lives over the last 4 or 5 months in different ways, and how we interact with our friends, family, colleagues, wider communities has changed. Again, there is evidence that the effects of the pandemic have not been experienced equally. Again, why does this matter? Chronic loneliness, again, it affects health and well-being. Loneliness can result in low mood, anxiety, low self-esteem, risky behaviour. Lonely people are more likely to suffer from depression, heart disease, and depression. Research shows that chronic loneliness is likely to increase your risk of death by 29%, and health-wise, loneliness is much worse for you than smoking. So at this time, it's interesting, a recent survey by the Office of National Statistics shows that about 1/3 of adults have said being lonely has affected their well-being during lockdown. And again, this has been not equal. Young people, those living alone, those with health conditions and the disabled have been much more likely to experience something the ONS have referred to as lockdown loneliness. Loneliness means we all have a greater understanding now. Having been locked down, we've not seen our friends, and hopefully will give us a greater empathy with those in our community who are lonely. Sue touched on this. I think some of the real positives from coronavirus is the springing up of new groups such as COVID-19 support in devices, who have reached out to communities, and by doing shopping and delivering prescriptions, they've made new connections and new friendships have been formed. And people that we identified for our research class as the hidden lonely, those people that maybe are not willing to identify themselves as lonely or seek support, some of this has been addressed and new connections have been made. Another charity, a county-wide one in this case, Alzheimer's Support. They provide support to those with dementia and their carers across Wiltshire. Just this week, on Tuesday, they reopened their Warminster Day Centre. But for some, the fear of leaving the safety of their home means that only about half of those who would normally attend will be going back to the day centre. The pandemic has affected many people in different ways. Some will be afraid to reconnect with activities that previously stopped them and their carers being lonely. And often voluntary sector organisations are grappling and struggling with how they address that, because social distancing rules still mean that they can't open their services or have to adapt them in different ways. The final theme I wanted to touch on was young people. I think at first glance, for me personally, they feel very much like the hidden victims. They're very unlikely to suffer directly from coronavirus, but they are suffering very many indirect consequences. Last week, we brought together 12 of the youth organisations from across Wiltshire that we fund to see and understand how they've been supporting young people. They've varied their contact, they're linking up with them virtually or detached work. But it's only very recently have youth centres been able to reopen, and many of them are still grappling with how they can do that safely. From their experience, young people's experiences have been really varied. Again, the inequality is emphasised again, particularly around schooling. Those from affluent backgrounds may have seen minimal disruption to their education. Particularly private schools have maintained full-time Zoom lessons. Kids have had contact with their teachers and their classmates. However, in contrast, many others have had very minimal contact or limited support at home, and the digital divide has really re-emphasised inequalities. Some have had little or no access to technology. Perhaps examples we were given with one family who shared a smartphone between 4 children and the parents. There was no way those 4 children would be able to do online teaching with the access that they had through their available technology. Many children will be living in families where incomes have changed. They will have experienced food poverty, they'll miss out on social contact, and they'll have lost that stability and support that school provides. We know from the youth workers we've spoken to, anxiety levels have been affected, increased social media usage, which has not always been positive, sexual grooming has been experienced, there's been increased self-harm, antisocial behaviour and violence in the home. Impacts have been felt in very many ways. For many children, return to school in September is seen as really daunting and creating real anxieties. And I know from contact with Wiltshire Council, they're really predicting spikes in safeguarding referrals as schools return. For older young people, transition to the next stage, whether that be on to another school, to university, college, apprenticeship or work, it's all now filled with uncertainty. What does their future hold? Are the jobs they were hoping to do available? So just to touch and reflect, really, we are in a situation of ongoing uncertainty. There is most definitely an increased need out there, and we're in a context where we've got an impending recession. We know from contact and work with our local authorities, they are looking at all the services that they provide. Wiltshire Council alone is predicting a £50 million deficit that it would not have had without coronavirus, based on the service provision they've provided and lack of government grants to support that. Swindon is less affected, but it's still less severe, but is still predicting a £12 million deficit, which means local authority services may not always be able to provide. So that coupled, there are challenging times ahead. I've touched on them a little bit. Reopening is much harder for voluntary sector organisations than going into lockdown was. They're in the forefront, they really want to respond, but social distancing means they are maybe restricted into the number of people that they can support. Having said that, there have been lots of positives. We've created new connections, as have a lot of the voluntary sector, new ways of working, strong new partnerships. A lot of the voluntary sector, us included, have strong and built new relationships with Wiltshire Council, which is really, really positive. And there are new ways of working. For example, Carers Support Wiltshire have been running their carers cafes virtually and have had an increase in the number of people they've been able to support. They're able to reach people virtually who were not able to physically attend some of their services previously. So there are positives, but we're in a time of uncertainty. And I think for all, the voluntary sector is there. It's there, it's striving, but the demand for services is anticipated at a time when sector and statutory partners will be under pressure. There's a drive and an appetite to build back better. I hear that again and again, and strong partnerships will forge through the crisis. It's on that note, I'd like to hand over to Suzanne, and I think strong partnerships is what certainly Citizens Advice is all about. They're very much in the forefront of work.
Good morning, everyone.
Around the pandemic and local people, and Suzanne will tell you a little bit more about how Citizens Advice are supporting people locally.
Thank you, Margaret. Sorry I jumped in before you'd finished. Good morning, everybody. I'm Suzanne Wigmore, and I'm the I'm the Chief Exec of Wiltshire Citizens Advice. So thank you and from sunny Bristol, hello. So Wiltshire Citizens Advice works across Wiltshire, providing advice and support, and we're delighted to be one of the 168 grant receivers for Wiltshire Community Foundation, and we know we're in rarefied company. We provide advice to around 18,000 people across Wiltshire every year, and that's by email, by web chat, by phone and by face-to-face. And like most of our colleagues across the country in Citizens Advice, we could have probably told you back in March exactly what we would have seen coming at us in the year ahead. We traditionally provide advice and information about welfare benefits, debt, housing and relationships, and everything that we knew about what we do and how we do it changed pretty much overnight. And that was the scenario we were faced with. As a charity, we have a business continuity plan. As the chief exec, I hope to write it, stick it in a drawer, and never have to look at it again. I've had to use it twice in 3 years, which is at least twice too many times. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about the situation we have in Wiltshire, and also how the grant from the Community Foundation will help us support the problems yet to come. And we've heard Sue speak very eloquently about the meal service and the things that the Community Foundation has funded. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what's coming at us and how the grant that we've had will help us in the months ahead. So as I said, most Citizens Advice could tell you exactly what they would see from year to year. We support people with welfare benefits, with universal credit and with debt. But we've seen a very different picture in Wiltshire. Wiltshire has traditionally been an area of relatively low unemployment. And that's something that has hidden some poverty, as Margaret has talked about. But we have seen almost overnight, almost 100,000 families and individuals in Wiltshire affected. So if we move on to the next slide, this is going to show some research from our friends at Bristol University that's telling us that in England, 28% of people are now struggling to make ends meet. And that's not a situation that we've seen in Wiltshire necessarily. So there's a whole new demographic in Wiltshire that we have seen, or we are beginning to see, that are younger, they're under 50, they're couples with children, they're tenants and homeowners, and usually in relatively good health, who have become seriously financially exposed. And they are the ones which you are supporting us to have additional paid staff, additional paid resource to help to support, because I fear that their problems are only just beginning, and that's what we're here to support with. So if we can move on to the next slide. So this is the Wiltshire impact. I've realised my 2 boxes still haven't got the right time periods on, but the blue bars are what was happening in March. And in March, there was before we went into lockdown, as I said, Wiltshire was in a relatively fortunate position. Unemployment was less than 1%. And all of a sudden by June, things had completely changed. So we've seen the number of people furloughed at the end of June, so being supported by the government scheme, 64,500 people have been furloughed, and another 18,000 are being supported by the self-employed support scheme. So we feel, Citizens Advice, we feel like we're a little bit in the eye of a storm. The initial health storm, the initial community response has happened. It's been fantastically successful. We feel we're sitting in a space where we know that these people are going to be impacted going forward, and it's how we support that. As well as the people that are furloughed and self-employed, we've also seen another 12,000 people move on to universal credit. So it took 5 years, and the DWP moving at DWP speed. It took 5 years in Wiltshire to get 16,000 people onto universal credit, and 5 weeks for another 12,000 to need to claim this additional benefit. So we've seen a big impact, and for these families, they're kind of sat there almost in a holding position, and we can see, and the Community Foundation have had the foresight to see what is coming at us over the next months and weeks ahead. So if we move on to the final slide, an ultimate slide, sorry. These families are being met with lack of income, they're struggling with their daily bills, they're mainly paying their utilities. This is from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. They're mainly paying their utilities, but lots of families are struggling to pay council tax, to pay rent, to pay mortgages. And what we are seeing at the moment is many, many protections. So there's lots of national protections, local grants to families and households who are having mortgage holidays. There's no evictions currently allowed. The Financial Conduct Authority are allowing free overdrafts. They've put a suspension on all collection of debt. So we're in a very strongly protected position, lots of families, until the 31st of October. But from August, the furlough scheme will begin to change, and we fear, we know, and if we could move on to the final slide, please, that these 80, 90,000 people are only really going to go one way. They're either going to return to work as before, return to work on less income and reduced terms and conditions, or unfortunately become unemployed. And I said at the beginning, we could tell you almost to the person what we would be seeing people seeking advice about. That has completely changed between March and July, and our number one advice issue has been employment. It's employment, it's redundancy, it's terms and conditions, it's people's rights, it's people's contracts, and it's what people will be able to do going forward. And this group, as I said before, they've never been in this position before, many of them. They've been working on a relatively secure income. They've been happily supporting their families. They never ever would have seen themselves in this position, and they never would have needed to seek our support. It's a completely new world for them. So they're faced not only with the shock of the change in income, but also the complete shock that this would never ever happen to them. And that's a big double impact to have to cope with for lots of these families. The good news, and there is good news, and I always tend to turn up being the bearer of bad news, but the really good news is we know that a relatively small intervention at the right time can make a massive, massive difference. So we will see the impact, the financial impact of coronavirus moving into 2020, 2021, 2022. We will maybe see people's housing positions threatened for 2 or 3 years in front. But what we know is if we can get in early, and as I said, the Community Foundation turned around our grant in an amazingly short time, and we already have additional paid staff in place. If we can get in early and speak to people, even if it's a half an hour or an hour phone call, just to move them towards the right route, to tell them about what their rights are with redundancy, to tell them that they can claim universal credit, to talk to them about how they speak to their mortgage providers. That early intervention can save thousands of pounds, hours of heartache, and a slide into poor mental health. And the grant from the Community Foundation is enabled to do that. So for us, it's a slightly different angle than the immediate intervention and the immediate community support, because we're looking, as I said, for months and years ahead. But it's that intervention now, the timeliness and the impact that we can have, that's going to stop people sliding into the need for support later on, which we know takes hundreds of hours and thousands of pounds to sort out later, rather than to catch it earlier. So that's who we are, and that's what we're doing with your money, with the Community Foundation's money, and we look forward to working with you in the months and years to come. I think we're going to pass you back to Fiona.
Actually, you've got somebody who's not quite so pretty. You've got me. Thanks, Suzanne. You know, it would be very easy to dwell on the negatives, but you know, my surname is Trueluck, and looking at the positive side, which is what we're really trying hard to do here, we've seen people and communities and partner agencies coming together in truly inspirational ways in the last 4 months. And if we could only just bottle that kindness and that community spirit that the crisis has released, then its legacy would surely be a stronger voluntary sector and a more caring society. And that's really the message we want people to go away with today. This is going to take a greater financial and time commitment than the £1 million we've raised so far. So we've taken at board level the strategic decision to commit to distribute at least £10 million to communities in need over the next 5 years. That's almost a doubling of our present level of giving. And it also, of course, means a brave commitment to a commensurate increase in fundraising. But we feel it's the least we can do if we are to share the pain and demonstrate a positive commitment to our communities at this difficult time. So on those two hopefully positive notes, let's take some questions. And if you've got a question, just raise your hand and wait to be nominated. Whether or not you've already posed it on the chat forum. I'll hand over to Fiona to marshal the questions.
We've got a question in already from Charmaine. Thank you, Charmaine. Did you want to ask your question yourself, or would you like me to run it through?
I don't mind. I'm happy to do it now. I'm unmuted. It was just to say, you mentioned the digital divide, which of course is, you know, is a phrase we're all very familiar with, and I appreciate it's a very complex one. I just wondered if there was any work being done either locally or nationally on trying to think through how this issue can be addressed, from people having broadband to literally having the hardware, a phone in their hand or a computer, and what the thoughts are on that.
Yes, so Ian came back. I'm not sure if everybody's seen the chat response from Ian, but Ian, would you like to just give a summary of what you know about this?
Yes, by all means, Fiona. We've been working, we being Business West, which is a business representative organisation and business support organisation, been working with Whitehorse Federation, which has got about 31 schools in its multi-academy trust, led by Dr. Nick Capstick, who some of you may well know, and is a very dynamic person and also very closely linked to Department for Education and is a special advisor there. With regards to engaging business and education together, to repurpose nearly new laptops and digital devices, if I can use that phrase, and through the schools network that he runs and the connections that he's got in education, to be able to help in some way solve that digital divide and provide the hardware, if nothing else. And they're repurposing the actual laptops, so they're all fit for purpose. So we've been working with some of the larger organisations in terms of their store cupboards, shall I say, full of slightly redundant but still very usable equipment, and make good use of them. Hopefully that in some way answers, but I'm happy to follow that up after the webinar.
Thanks, Ian. I think Margaret's got some information as well to add in.
Yeah, thanks for the feedback, Ian, and Charmaine, thanks for the question. I think it's a really mixed, complex picture. So I think there's lots of work going on to support young people in schools that Ian has touched on. And there is a government scheme, but I think in reality that actually doesn't go any way to meet the need out there in terms of our young people. I know the government scheme, for example, the Wiltshire Council got a very small number of laptops and they've still not reached the young people. We've certainly funded some projects, and I know Building Bridges, which some of you may be familiar with, is a partnership of 10, 20 different organisations that deliver a re-employment project with European funding, and that's led by Community First. So they put a joint bid into the National Lottery to get laptops to provide support for people back to work, and also their Youth Action Wiltshire project. So they actually have provided IT kit to some of the most disadvantaged young people they work with and support. And because of the way that was done, that's been a lot more immediate. And that's equally an example of a project that, as some of the working strands through the response and recovery that we got involved with Wiltshire Council, have developed a number of start and finish groups, and one of those is about internet access. So that's created a new partnership. I think, so for example, the procurement team at Wiltshire Council were involved in that, enabling, and actually were able to source the IT kit that the voluntary sector were buying, but got them at cost and at bulk through. So that was a really good partnership that developed. There's lots of little pilots going on, some of which we've funded. So I know there's a project in Salisbury, Safer Supportive Salisbury, which is older people getting iPads to older people to upskill them, to enable them to use them. Similarly, care home volunteers, we funded them to provide iPads into care homes, so people in care homes could actually FaceTime or video call their families. So there's lots of little things going on. I think the gaping hole is the strategic overview that solves the digital connection for those people who can't necessarily afford it. There's another piece of partnership work which had developed really well through the working group, was the national health through the CCG. A colleague at the CCG Southwest has put in a proposal to basically identify that digital exclusion is a personalisation need in the health setting, so which is a really good way forward. So actually a GP, I think it's a leap to say a GP would then prescribe a laptop or an IT, but that now is part of a GP's or a health assessment of actually what are people's needs, and if online access is one of those things, then that can be part of their personal health plan. But it's not as simple as just kit. It could well be, and is often, about capacity or willingness or ability to use as well. So it's not just about the kit or the access. I think it was really interesting. I had a conversation. I'll try and, in case there's any other questions, there's one more point.
Margaret, sorry, we've got some others
okay.
Up, so I don't know, we can follow up with Charmaine with a separate with an email afterwards, because there's quite a bit more detail to add in, isn't there?
Absolutely.
We've got Gary. Do you want to say something, Gary? Gary Lawrence.
Hi, yeah, I've just put something in the chat, just about Heels in Malmesbury, again about laptops, about a group that's just supplying laptops on a local level by for people to donate laptops, and they drop them off at the co-op, and then a local IT firm which has refurbished the laptops. I think Heels have paid for some Windows 10 to be installed on them, and they've gone out to families, low-income families who've got children who are unable to connect to schoolwork. It's often been using the parents' phones to try and do the homework on, and that's been successful. And now they're extending that to older people as well, older people who are isolated and unable, who've got families living further away. So it's just I don't want you to say, just a local group that's kind of seen that problem and sorted it out themselves.
Brilliant. I'm just conscious that we've got 4 minutes left before you're all released off for lunch. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to raise? We've got nothing else raised on the chat function, but it's an open floor, so please do ask.
Whilst people are thinking, I just really quickly say, I think it's really an interesting conversation I had with Carer Support Wiltshire yesterday, that they've done a survey and there's a big proportion of their carers don't have internet access, but of those who don't, 50% of them don't even want it. So I think there is equally as a recognition that digital isn't the solution for everything on everybody.
Any other questions, anybody? No? Oh, sorry, I saw a hand and then I...
Sorry, if there's no one else, if I can ask a second one.
Please do.
You mentioned a group of youth organisations, I think you said 12 to 15, who had come together last week, I think it was, and looked at... I just wondered if there was any information either now or later by email that would just give a sense of those organisations and what they had, if there was a kind of coherent summing up that could be passed on of what they felt the issues were locally and how they may be all working together or not working together, whatever was appropriate.
Yeah, no, absolutely planning to do that. In fact, I'm on leave next week and it's on my to-do list to write that note up this week. And then once we've run it past the groups, just to check whether they've got anything else they want to add or whether we've captured everything that they shared with us, that would then be an open note that would be a kind of collaborative note based on these are some of the voices that things young people are experiencing from a youth worker perspective. And we're really keen to try and develop something further to take it that next step of actually capturing youth voice rather than youth workers' voice, because I think the two, there's a subtle distinction, and I think actually heightening young people articulate what their challenges are is of ultimate value as well. So we are very happy to share it once it's in a shareable form with anybody. We probably put it on our website, but I'm very happy to share it with you directly, Charmaine.
Thank you.
Fiona, Karen had something on ethnic minorities.
Yes, I've got that. So Karen's just said, Karen Hobbs, who's from our grants team, has just said it's important to note that people from some minority ethnic communities are being disproportionately affected and that we're doing some work on that. And we absolutely are doing some work on that. I don't know, again, Margaret, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, happy to. So we're doing that in a number of different ways. I think the reality is, so we were asked by WCF, how many Black and minority ethnic groups have you funded? You know, obviously awareness has been raised that they are often underrepresented, and there's a big movement in the funding sector to kind of challenge ourselves and address that. And I think it's not necessarily, we have funded a number of groups. Harbour Project was a great example of that. But I think what we're trying to do is build some really strong relationships with some of the groups that we've funded before and new ones that we haven't, so that really it's about building relationships and actually providing them with capacity to maybe able to apply. We're working with VAS, Voluntary Action Swindon in Swindon. They've got a worker whose remit is to do this, and we're proactively working with them. And we're linked in, I'm linked in with the Wiltshire Faith Network, and we've got links through there and have made some connections through there and having, you know, one-to-one follow-up meetings with organisations and offering support. So I think it's a long journey, and we're doing it in lots of different ways.
Thanks, Margaret. So we're at 12 o'clock, everybody, so thank you. It's been a whirlwind. I'm just going to pass you over to Ashley for a farewell and thank you.
Yeah, just a tail end to that last question. I've been working with MPs in Swindon, including the Lord Chancellor, on the asylum issue in Swindon. We've got a lot of asylum seekers in Swindon who aren't being looked after terribly well by the Home Office. We've been able to raise the profile of them and get some help. I'm also, through my previous connections, very close to the Nepalese and Indian communities. And the great thing about these ethnic minority communities is they are very strong communities. They take a pride in not asking for help. So we've really got to be quite proactive in going out and seeking. And what Margaret's outlined there is really important. They need to reach out as well as just go that little bit extra. So anyway, just a thank you really to Fiona and the speakers, and indeed the whole of the Wiltshire Community Foundation team for putting this together today. I claim no credit for it. So thank you, Fiona and the team. Great effort. Thank you all for coming and showing an interest and donating, as I say, either your time, your effort, or just your support. It's much appreciated, because without you, we wouldn't have been able to do what we've been able to do so far in terms of our initiative. And we've got, as you can hear, we've got even greater plans going forward. So thank you very much indeed. And I hope you've enjoyed and perhaps learned something in the last hour or so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.